if we want to add a discussion of stormwater controls to the agenda with the planning board. I mean, I'm all right with that. So I would move to set, I've been flagged.
So the only thing I'm going to say is there are people here that have committed to 2 hours.
Right.
We already have 3 items on the agenda. So we weren't sure we were going to even get to the short-term rentals as it is. So, of course, it's up to the board to see if you want to speak to that or at a future meeting.
I mean, I'll move to add it, and if we don't get to it, we don't get to it.
Fine.
So I would move to set the agenda and add stormwater controls as B4. If we don't get to it, we don't get to it.
I'll second.
Aye.
Oh, you don't like case on 6. Okay.
First item on the agenda is missing middle housing discussion.
Thank you, Mayor.
Demetri's.
Yeah, Demetri is here. If I could do a brief introduction.
He's at the door. You're on the program.
Okay, if I could do a brief introduction. So this item comes to you from actually 2 prior discussions. The first was a meeting with the small development firms earlier in the spring where they had a joint workshop with the council and talked about the need for different housing options within the city. That was followed by the request by council to revisit the apartment building form and allowing for the apartment building form in certain areas of the city and prohibiting it in other areas. So at that meeting where staff received the direction, we did throw out the idea of still allowing for some multifamily housing in the other parts of the city through different housing options, and that was specifically mentioned the missing middle. So staff has worked on 2 different draft ordinances. The first ordinance was the directive from council just to remove the apartment building form out of most of the zoning districts except the highway corridor area and institutional campus zoning district, which would be like Belmont Abbey's campus. And we started on the second ordinance to incorporate the missing middle, but what we quickly found is we need assistance in this. It's to ensure that we are looking at the appropriate housing form for Belmont. We need to reach out to a consultant, have them work with us on this alternative ordinance. And so I've reached out to Demetri Baches, who has a lot of background and expertise in this area, to first of all present information of exactly what the missing middle is, how it fits into Belmont, and then get direction from council if we'd like to proceed doing this alternative ordinance as well. So I'm going to keep it short since we have multiple items on the agenda and turn it over to Demetri.
I don't know if I should hop in the middle and just spin around or go around the edge. I think I'm like going to go in the middle so that people aren't craning their necks. All right. Always missing. Yeah, let's hear that. The middle is not missing anymore. Some of us wish we could do that.
Now, Demetri, if you start twirling, we'll what? Because we'll follow you, okay?
We have to have more talking about it than have to do it. All right, so the missing middle. That actually is a coined marketing name that was developed, I think, several years ago by a colleague and friend of mine named Dan Carroll, who works for a firm called Opticos. You've probably seen, that's a great shot of downtown Belmont, by the way, from 1954, I believe. Right. Next slide. Coined by my friend to talk about all the types of housing that we no longer build in the United States. Back around 1940, 1950, 1960, up until probably the early 80s, there were significant amounts of housing that were built in the United States, in cities and towns, that were duplexes, triplexes, stacked multifamily, which is these little mansion flats that look like homes but actually are apartment buildings, cottage courts, all kinds of innovative housing that systematically was made illegal through zoning and financing. Banks made it impossible to lend to get those to happen. Zoning then followed suit and just made them illegal by right. So you had to actually ask for them. And because it became more difficult to build them, builders stopped building them. So not only were they made illegal and erased over time, the ability to build them correctly was lost in the professions because no one actually built them anymore. All the builders, and there were many builders back in the day, right? There weren't just 5. It wasn't like Pulte, Lennar, Ryan Homes, and Toll Brothers. There were hundreds of builders, right? That employed a mass amount of people in the United States. It was an industry that ranged from people that built 2 or 3 homes a year to 30 to 50 to 60 to 100, and they were each in their region. So you had a huge economy that supported the development of all these different housing types that provided housing opportunities for people that didn't have enough money, for example, when they got out of college or school or came back from the military, to buy a single-family house right out of the gate. They could get into these starter homes and move themselves up and around the system. All that went away. So what you end up with is this bar, and it's almost like a barbell now. The only thing we built, I'm exaggerating slightly, okay? So there's a lot of, it needs to be exaggerated a little bit because what happened was a travesty. And a lot of the problems we have in our cities today, the housing crisis that exists today by every municipality in this country, and all the other social issues that come from that stem from the fact that we only build 2 things now. We build single-family houses and we build apartment buildings. And when we're only building apartment buildings, as recently as we only started really doing that in a good way, probably about 15, 20 years ago. So there's a giant gap. The biggest growth spurt in the United States was accommodated basically by single-family housing development, whether you needed it or not, right? In the United States, demographically speaking, most people would prefer something other than a single-family house. 35 to 42% of the population on any given survey done by research companies like Pew over the past 15, 20, 30 years show that the preferred housing type for 30 to 40% of the population is single family. The other 60 to 70%, that's not their preferred type. And yet we build almost none of that type, which is the missing middle type. We build everything that's single family. And as I said, just recently we started building multifamily in a way that is conducive to creating urbane and urban living. I'm not talking multifamily as in garden apartment complexes, which is the bane of just about every municipality, right? The large, really awful apartment buildings that are all splattered about, grassy slopes in the midst of parking lots and stuff. I'm talking about really cool apartment buildings like they used to build them. Apartment buildings that would sit up to the street, create sidewalk traffic. Some of the ground floors may have had commercial in them, et cetera, things that would add to the development of the city, not tax the city and its resources by having to provide services to them because there were a lot of density in far-flung places. So that barbell you see, that's the only thing we do in the United States. The thing at the end and the thing at the other end. Next slide. So what is that stuff in the middle? Stuff in the middle, the reason Dan calls it the missing middle is because it does 2 things. First, it actually is the middle stuff that's no longer there, it's missing. It's also the income brackets that have gone missing. And what it looks like is in scale, which is the most important thing to understand about missing middle. The scale of missing middle is that of the single-family house type. Single-family house type has a 1 to 3 story mass. It typically is a gable roof or a pitched roof. You can have a flat roof at times, but typically it's a house-looking thing. Right? And what the missing middle used to do when they used to build it, and you can go to any town, any city in the United States, and drive by any pre-war subdivision, most of the inner city neighborhoods now, and all of them, for the most part, have been bid up to extraordinary prices because they're so valuable for people. You go to any of those neighborhoods, and you will see missing middle stock everywhere. And maybe people won't even know it is. You go to Dilworth, in Myers Park, in Charlotte, you drive down those big streets with big trees and the big houses. Probably 2 out of 10 homes there are duplexes, triplexes, or stacked apartments. Right? And no one complains. A lot of missing middle, it was even more back in the day. A lot of it has been taken out of circulation by being bought up and made into single family houses because it's easier to do now. The zoning in Charlotte was anti-missing middle as well for a while. That's now back a bit, so it's easier to get back and redevelop those as duplexes, triplexes, and multifamily stacked mansion flats and so forth. But for a while they were gone, and these houses became single family houses. You have 2 examples of those here in Belmont. The Woodrow Wonder, I think it was, back when I was here in 1992. I used to be the planning director here from 91 to now, Parks, I can't remember. It was a while ago. That house was, I think, you said a 4-plex.
Yes.
Yeah, a 4-plex. Now someone bought it and renovated it. It's a single family house, but that's a 4-plex house. It was built as a 4-plex. The house behind the old city hall is also a 4-plex. There were probably others too that just have escaped, people's memories that had been renovated back into single family houses. But that stock was even here, right? And it looked like that. So the little quotes you see there, one of the biggest proponents now of missing middle housing is the AARP. Because they finally realized, wow, just about all of our constituency does not want to live in a single family house. We got to get out and, sow the seeds to get back that missing middle stuff. So the AARP is really big. If you Google missing middle AARP, you'll see all these events and presentations that they do, and all the outreach that they're doing to try to get that to become a more accepted housing type again for their constituencies. It's also great for starter families, people that are just getting out of school, just about to have kids, or just have kids. It's that jump, right? You come on. Not everybody here. I would dare say just about anybody in this room who first got out of college or high school or out of some service in the military was not able to afford a single family house right out of the chute. That's a huge part of the population. So the solution to building a great place is not to only think about the single family house, it's to think about all the other housing types that help people to concentrate in an area to create the jobs and the vitality and the income and the tax base required to keep cities healthy. We're going to get to why this is such a big problem today in just a moment. The AARP, multiple surveys asking people 55 years of age and older about their preferred housing type. On average, 65% describe the missing middle unit as their ideal house. But less than 7% of all housing units produced between 1990 and 2022 in the United States were missing middle. Next slide, Shelley. So, the missing middle. Oh, that came out wonky. That should have been a nice straight line of text. I don't know why. Oh. It's the transition from Pages to Microsoft Word, I think. So, single family, multifamily on both ends. But then you have the accessory dwelling unit, that should be ADU, not AD and then U. So, accessory dwelling unit, and then the duplex. Then it goes to the triplex and the fourplex. The apartment courtyard building, you see those all over the place. They're very popular in the Southwest U.S. LA has the apartment courtyard type everywhere. Cottage courts, clusters of small homes. Again, that's a big thing. That actually in the Midwest is also a big housing type prior to it being illegal. Townhomes, you all know about townhomes. That's the easiest with the missing middle housing to be built, which is why you see it everywhere now. That was the first thing that banks sort of said, we can kind of get our head around this. It's a house. It's just connected. You get through some building code issues. You can finance that. You can resell it on the secondary mortgage market. It became easy to do, so boom, everything is a townhome, right? So now it's really, in most cities, it's the single family house, the townhome, and the apartment. Those are the only three things that get built. Mansion flats, which are what look like large homes, but are actually apartments. It's a multifamily building. They call them 6 packs, 12 packs, 12 packs, and 24 packs. It is the structure that gets just below what you would imagine being a very large apartment building. Live works, which are residential above commercial, one mortgage, one owner, two uses, and then the shop house, which can be 2 owners or 1 owner, with a much more substantial commercial use of the ground floor. The live work is more of a home occupation type use on the ground floor, where the shop house is a full-on, could be a restaurant, it could be an office.
It could be a shop house.
It could be a shop house. So that whole typology, all that range in the middle that you see there, used to be actively built and financed in the United States for decades. Unfortunately, it was in the decades where we weren't growing. Well, we did. The 50s and 60s were a pretty big growth spurt for the United States, but even that's dwarfed by the amount of housing that's been built since about 1980. So at just the moment that we needed to have all of these things in the mix to make life easier for people and less expensive for people, we stopped building it all. And that's when all the crises that you hear about now start. Right? From before 1970, I'll give you one example. Next slide. The crises started, slowly but surely. People who were anti-density, income biased, let's just put it politely like that, income biased, began to make it difficult to have these types of units in, because the family types that were moving into them, the age types that were moving into them, were not like their types. And so cities started systematically making it harder. Zoning was the big tool, but zoning wasn't the first tool. It was bank financing that made it hard. Redlining and so forth made it very difficult. Loans and stuff, government loans, didn't go back into renovation for houses. They went to new housing. The FHA loans after the war, unlike in Canada, where you were allowed to use money to renovate existing stock, in the U.S. you could only apply it mostly to new stock, brand new housing. That's why most of the cities in the United States, unlike Canada, deteriorated in the core, because no one had the money to do anything about that old stock back in the day. It just all withered away. Right? All the money went to the suburbs. So it was a huge subsidization of the single-family house type. And the building industry got behind that 1,000,000%. That's where Pulte and all these big companies come from. They didn't exist back then. Like I said, there were hundreds and hundreds of builders. They all eventually died, and the biggest ones came up, and now the biggest ones own basically the entire market for building homes in the United States. Do you all know when manufactured housing started? Has manufactured housing always been in the United States? Manufacturing housing began to be a popular and actually in-demand type of housing at just about the same time that ADUs, accessory dwelling units, were made illegal in the United States. People were able back in the day, they're called granny flats, or the garage apartment. You put your elderly mother up there or something.
Or the Fonz. Didn't the Fonz live in the garage?
The Fonz,
yes.
The Fonz lived in a granny flat, right?
Yes.
So, what that did was it allowed people to subsidize their mortgage. So in one foul swoop, that was made illegal. So it became harder for people who had their house to keep affording their house over time, because then they paid the full mortgage. And the people that couldn't afford the house no longer could live in the apartment, in the unit behind, because it was made illegal to do so. I remember when we rewrote the code here in Belmont, it was illegal to have more than one unrelated relative or unrelated person living on the same lot. That's code speak for you can't rent out your granny flat. So that was all gone. At just about that time is when the manufactured housing industry started. Why? Because where are these people going to live? It's not that you can just get rid of the idea that you can't live in above the garage. These people have to go somewhere. No one came up with a solution. Private industry said, you know what? We can build these really cheap, portable, mobile units That's why they exist. And they exist in most places around the South and Midwest where there was a significant amount of that housing type that became illegal. So we can actually see it geographically, why it is and where it is. Next slide. So that's the little quote there about the ADU and what happened to it. The bar on the bottom, I'm working with the city of Gastonia as we speak. I'm rewriting their ordinance to allow missing middle housing. They came to the conclusion 2 years ago that a lot of their problems stem from the fact that first, they're not growing. The second thing is when they do grow, they tend to grow in only one way, which is single-family houses or really bad duplexes. And okay, now with the growth beginning to happen, they're getting a flood of apartment buildings that they're not very happy about, the big apartment building complexes. So I analyzed their ordinance, and that bar basically is green means go, yellow means slow, red means no. And you'll see that their old code, how much red is on that, right? They too, like every other place I've been, totally subsidizes and encourages single-family housing by right everywhere. There's no issue about it. The only worry they have is if it's got vinyl siding and whatnot. Otherwise, it's a done deal. Everything else is a battle. So we're slowly chipping away at that red, making that green and yellow, shrink it to get rid of it. And at the moment, we're about this will be the 3rd year in, and we've made huge headway. I'll show you a few of those images in a moment. Next. And it was so much ingrained in the American sort of psyche and history about this type of housing that it is actually odd that we're even talking about it today, like it's this thing, this bizarre thing that we have to make some sort of apology for, that we're trying to bring it back. Sears, Roebuck, well, besides selling goods and stuff like Woolworth did in the 5 and dime shop, they made huge amounts of money. Almost their entire sort of growth as a company stemmed from the fact that you could buy homes in their catalog, the Sears Roebuck catalog homes. You would buy this, and they would ship it to you, and you would build it. Look at those prices. $2,000. Wouldn't that be something to buy a house for $2,000 today? Of course, that's relative to when this was done, but still, it's kind of funny to see those prices. There were hundreds of these. You get a whole catalog, just like you get the old Sears catalog. Some of you are too young to even know what a catalog is. But there's these thick books that come out in the mail, like a phone book. You probably don't know what a phone book is, but the phone book would come in, it would sit there, and you would be able to buy anything. Cars, clothes, foodstuffs, and then there's this huge section on housing. And that's just 3 of probably 10,000 different housing things you could have bought from Sears back in the day. And that's why you see a lot of these communities when you drive around these older neighborhoods in these towns and cities. You'll see all these homes that look very similar on these beautiful tree-lined streets, parking on both sides and the kids playing ball and the American flag waving around. All these homes, you'll see them. They're everywhere. There might even be, I don't know if there's any in Belmont. There might have been at some point. But there's definitely, if you go to Plaza Midwood in Charlotte, there are Sears Roebuck homes there. And they're all over the United States. So it's something that we used to do really well in this country. Next. And the examples are everywhere. Literally anywhere you drive, in any place in the United States that's above the size of a small town, you will see missing middle housing type. And they blend in perfectly with the housing stock, which again is the critical differentiation between what missing middle is and what large multifamily apartment buildings are. Those buildings are in mass and disposition and volume and height different from a house. But what they service is important because you have to have in the community the ability to have more people living in less space in order to afford the services required to keep your community ahead of the game and make it an actual town or place. So the ability to mask or hide density becomes critical. And the way you do that is to make sure you're blending in the building type that you are proposing these people live in. And if it looks like a house, functions sort of like a house, most people don't care if 2 families or 3 families or 4 families live in it. So the important thing is that it is not a large building. Those don't work. Next. And these are just images that I've taken. You can find off the internet. There's hundreds of them. Next. This is the more commercial component. When you have a ground floor that is retail of some kind, this is what blends into your commercial corridors. And that's important. And I'll tell you why in just a second. Next. And here's the one in Belmont, behind City Hall. I don't have a picture of the Woodrow Wonder, but it's on the internet, and I just saw a photo of it as it was renovated a little bit ago. It looks spectacular. It's a single-family house, and hopefully one day it'll go back as an apartment, because that's a fantastic 4-plex unit. Where missing middle goes. Missing middle is critically important in the spaces between your downtown and beside commercial corridors that abut eventually into single-family housing neighborhoods. It is the feathering in of density, increasing density from a single-family house to the core or to a corridor, and decreasing density from the corridor or the core back to the single-family house. In most new places that you see now in the United States, it is abrupt. Right? You leave the commercial corridor and the downtown, and boom, you're in single family. There is no more in new communities. In old communities, you see that progression, that slow progression from the larger buildings in the downtown to the smaller and medium-sized buildings, and then to the single family neighborhoods. In new places, it is big and small. Right? It's the Lowe's, Home Depot, the back service parking lot, usually a giant fence, wall, or berm, and then there's single family homes that face away, because that's so awful, and they face inward into a cul-de-sac. That's how we build American cities now. You can feather missing middle into a lot of parts, into different parts of the neighborhood. You can distribute it through a block with the form of ADUs, right? And smaller homes, breaking up large lots into 2, for example, and building the same kind of house, just smaller. You can put it on the end of a block that abuts a busier road, right? Because these are able to take that sort of environment better than just a plain single-family house. You can put it as a transition to higher density, where you might actually have apartments, big apartment buildings. It's the stuff that happens between the big apartment building and the single-family house on one side. And it can be a transition to a commercial corridor, like your main street. It is what allows people to live as close as possible to your main street, so they can walk to your main street and support all the shops and businesses on the main street, and not have to do that by getting into a car. So you reduce the need to constantly be fussing about how many parking decks you have to build in your community to service the 5 restaurants that might be in your downtown. If you have enough people living within a 5-minute walk of your downtown, it doesn't matter if you build a parking garage or not, because everybody can walk to these businesses, and you can have more than just 5 restaurants downtown. Next. Taking out one, this is the first unit that we did for Gastonia, the cottage court. Next. And it looks something like this. The diagram on the right also was done by Dan Perolic. Dan sort of become the missing middle guru. When he had that epiphany with that fantastic marketing name, Missing Middle, he went all out to town with that. He wrote a book, he did a video, he was on a speaker tour. Missing Middle is his baby. And he has wonderful images and diagrams. And all the images and diagrams you saw before that were his. Right? So they're pretty fantastic. But the cottage court is a really interesting type. When you have large lots in a suburban setting and you want to start creating more affordable housing, it's not that you build cheaper homes, it's that you built the homes smaller. Less materials, less square footage, smaller price initially. Whereas a lot of these are so desirable that they still get bid up eventually. Right? That's where other factors need to come in from the municipality side to help subsidize that type of housing, just as single-family housing was subsidized before. So it's all a mix and match and making sure that the finances work. But the cottage court is a wonderful model. It's typically 4 to 12 or 15 homes around a central space. They may have no parking requirements, or the parking occurs on a ring on the outside. It creates amazing density at a scale that is completely neighborhood friendly, as you can see by those pictures. They can be wooded, they're grass, they're green. They don't look or smack of being, high density, scary places. They can be made attractive by the fact that on a small site, you have enough housing on there that the developer can make the numbers work. The other thing about regular subdivisions are that to build cheaper, you usually don't decrease the footprint of the house, because that's the major selling point. They just make the house as cheap as possible, so when you close the door, the whole house shakes, because it's just lying on the toothpicks. Right, so they have no budget to do anything except grass. And if they have a retaining pond, they just put a fence around the pond. When you have density, you can start adding amenities. When you have small lots like this is probably 1.5 acres. You put 6 or 7 homes on it, all of a sudden you have the money, because the homes are smaller, you have a little bit more money to better amenitize the spaces. Next. So that drawing is the 5-minute walk from a core. And you can see this is a typical American suburban piece of the city, and that's the zoning map with the building footprints. And you can see it's big buildings and then little buildings. There's no gap. And the line between the different colors is commercial zoning and single family zoning. And where that line occurs is exactly what we just described, right? The 8-foot wall, the dumpsters, the big berm, the planting, and then you might as well be on a different planet on one side or the other. You don't see or integrate with those at all. There is no more expensive model than that in the world in terms of how you would want to develop a city. If you chose to figure out how to make a place go bankrupt, this is exactly how you would do it. And this is exactly how most places in the United States get built. The affordability crisis is because of the misuse of the land that is proximate to the area that is the most valuable part of the city. The accessibility, mobility, affordability, this is probably since about the 1960s. A lot of that is due to driving, and I'll tell you about the parking in the middle. But all of these, no matter how close you are to anything, typically you are signing a piece of paper, or you don't know you're signing a piece of paper that says if you're choosing to live in this environment, you will have to have a car. Each driving adult will have to have a car. And you will have to make between 9 and 17 trips a day just to survive. That's a lot of driving to do just to live. And between 9 and 17 trips is a huge impact on the environment and on people's budget. The average car costs an American between $50,000 and $90,000 a year. Just figure out the mortgage rate of that. How much house you could buy if you could live with one less car. Imagine how much house you could buy if you could live with no car. What your lifestyle would be if you didn't have $50,000 to $90,000 a year of car payments, insurance, gas, maintenance, the actual car itself. Next. And that goes to parking. Missing middle is and should not be heavily parked. I don't know if you all have been reading of late the trend, which is growing, which is a good trend, to eliminate what's called minimum parking requirements. Along with zoning and financing, another sort of covert action to make things more expensive and reduce access to housing and mobility was the requirement that you had to park minimum number of cars for every single use. Now, this is an interesting thing, because the parking manuals that were developed back in the 40s and 50s, the ADJOURNMENT manual, the ITE books, all the engineering, you almost call them Bibles, because literally they determine how everything in America looks. These books, these engineering books on how roads are to be built, how intersections are how to be designed, how parking requirements are to be delegated, dictate everything about the design of the place. zoning is down here, finance is probably over here, and then the engineering standards are here. They're what dictate basically everything. Minimum parking requirements means that no matter if you need the parking or not, you are building this many parking spaces. Well, that's okay, because when you look at the parking book and you say, well, it says that this bowling alley needs 4 cars per wing, or this use needs 1 car per 8 seats, or that house needs 1 car per bedroom, or 1 car per unit. You know, all these very defined statistical analyses and charts and tables that say this is what these are. But when you actually study these, you realize that first they range a great deal from place to place, which is odd. You know, I don't know why in Charlotte the number of cars parked for a single family unit is different than in Gastonia, which is different than in Kannapolis. We're not that far apart. Parking requirements are very different. And then you actually read these parking requirements. It's all done by regression analysis, which is mumbo jumbo. It's actually a very important tool, but the way that the engineering profession uses it to justify parking requirements, when you read the regression analysis outcomes, you will see that it says at the bottom, it says the R factors are non-correlatable for almost every single one, which means what? They guessed. They just made it up. All these parking requirements that people go crazy about at every hearing and public hearing and city council meeting, and people are nuts about this use and not enough parking, those are all made up. Those numbers mean absolutely nothing. Parking minimums destroy value. 2 spaces. Average monthly rent impact, this is in Austin, Texas, is $1,404 a month extra for 2 on-site spaces. $51,000 more dollars required in your income to park 2 cars, which you may or may not need. And you can see if you reduce that, the impact it has. It's substantial. People used to say it's the zoning, you know, it's the building requirements and codes. That's what makes housing expensive. The biggest piece of the expense of housing, well, there's 2: the land and the parking requirements. Those 2 things are monstrous. And the one you can control is the parking requirement. If you get rid of the parking requirement, all of a sudden a lot of things become affordable. And that's only now beginning to resonate in a few places. One of the bravest things I think that you will have read recently, if you follow this thing, is that Charlotte, Grubb Ellis did a project, or is doing a project in South End where he's doing a multifamily project, and he's providing no parking. 0. He's having all the tenants sign a piece of paper saying, we have no car, we do not need a car. And to live in this development, you can't have a car, basically. There's other things that go with it, but basically they're foregoing they're explaining to people that we don't need a car, or we don't have to have a car parked at this project, so, you know, we're gonna buy into it knowing that you are not providing us any parking.
So what you're saying is walkability or public transportation?
It is, which makes it very difficult to do a lot of this stuff everywhere, because you have to, because as we were saying earlier, the way most places are built now, you have to drive there. It's not as easy as just don't provide the parking, because you literally have to have a car to go to the store, do all kinds of things. What we're saying is reducing the minimum, right-sizing it so that it's not required that you have 2, well, in some municipalities, it's 1 per bedroom to have a car. You realize that? 1 car per bedroom. You have a 4-bedroom house, you're required to show that you can provide 4 on-site parking spaces. And some communities are ratcheting into that level of discourse when they talk about their parking requirements. Others have dialed it back down to 1 per unit, not 1 per bedroom. But now more and more, people are starting to say, why do we even need to have minimums? Reverse it. Put it as a maximum. And let the market decide how much parking is going to be required. Because at the end of the day, a bank's not going to finance your project if it feels that what you're doing is not viable. Right? Grubb had to go through hoops to convince his lender, even though the city was very happy to say, oh, cool, we're got this really neat thing. No parking. Look at us, how progressive we are. We're not requiring any parking. Didn't matter. The bank was going to say, dude, you're going to provide parking, or you're not getting your loan. So an entire series of discussions had to come up, how they're going to guarantee this, what's going to happen. These people had to sign papers, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a Herculean task. And this is in South End, where you could say that you could survive without a car. It's not quite there yet, but it's more plausible there than, for example, on South Point, where it's impossible. So we're not saying get rid of cars. We're saying reduce the minimum to maximum, and let the people come to you when they're doing their development and say, we only need this number of car spaces for our units, because this is the people that we're attracting. They've agreed this, that, and the other. It's a slow process of learning how all that works to get back to where it becomes an easier thing to happen. Because missing middle housing, if you have to have cars, minimum car requirements in your code is heavily car oriented in terms of parking, whatever benefit you were going to get from the affordability of the missing middle housing goes away. And then also at the same time, you're not going to get the density on the lot. Because remember, as soon as you can see these little boxes, they're cartoony, illustrative, but as soon as you're putting cars on the lot, there's less place to put building on the lot. The more cars you put on the lot, the less space you have to put building on the lot. The less building you have on the lot, you know how that goes. So parking is a key component of this. It's finding a location for the housing, right, close to centers or corridors, and changing the ordinance from a minimum to a maximum parking requirement, and then working with lenders in your local area and builders to begin to figure out how to reintroduce the housing type from a constructability point of view in your community. And Belmont will not be the first to do this. Belmont was the first in 1992 to adopt a code that allowed missing middle. When we wrote the code back in 1992, which has now changed since then, in 1992, the ordinance, for the first time for an existing municipality, reintroduced the idea that you could have all of these units in the zoning. So it was the first back then. It will not be the first to do this, which is great, because you're not the bleeding edge anymore. You know, the spear point where the pain and suffering happens. A lot of places, Gastonia is doing it, and Lowell is actually looking at doing it. So you'll be in good company. This is the ordinance for the cottage court in Gastonia. It was adopted just last year. And we already have developers looking to build. These were plans submitted for approval. There's already developers looking to, well, obviously before the interest rates went up and the housing market stopped as of about 4 weeks ago. They had a lot of plans in place to start doing this. This is middle housing from the cottages and townhomes to rental duplex communities, right? That all look like regular neighborhoods. So they're actively pursuing this in Gastonia. Next. And, you know, for Belmont, which is actually in a better position to benefit from this type of infill development, it should be something as a top priority for council and planning board to start to visit and think about. There's a lot of places, there are sufficiently enough places in Belmont where you could look to rezone properties to allow this to happen. Remember, you all are on a peninsula. There's only so much growth that will ever happen here, and you don't want to trap yourselves in a model that is unsustainable before you can actually benefit from the growth that happens here. And one of the ways to do that is to make sure you use the land that you have very wisely in those places where you could reintroduce some of this housing and adapt your code to begin that process. And it's more than just the code, but a big step would be to at least zone it, to shoot the first flare across the bow to get people to understand where you're heading, and then work out the other issues involved with financing and helping with the financial component of it and the parking. That's it. Questions?
I have a question. development you're talking about in Charlotte, where you don't have a car, okay, how do you accommodate people who are coming to visit those people? Do you have some parking spaces for
On the
that,
street.
them, or on the street? Okay. And
It's the
how,
great thing about streets, they're multitasking.
and how large a unit are you talking about for that?
I don't know the details of the
Go ahead.
unit. I think they're 1 and 2 bedrooms. I
Right.
think the total number of units is just shy of 100.
Okay.
It's not a huge project. And I don't know where they are. I know it was approved. I don't know if they've broken ground yet.
Okay.
Is this near a light rail, by any chance?
It's, well, the light rail isn't too far away. It's not on the light rail. It's a little bit further out, but it's within a 10-minute walk. Typically, if you're within a light rail, the pedestrian shed is 10 minutes. So, Matt, you had a question?
Yeah, I do good with examples. So I think we have one coming up, just to play it out. The Central Park, right? Is that what it's called?
Central Park South.
So for me, that development is going over across from Stowe Manor and sort of fits within this idea of being close enough to downtown, but not so far down the peninsula that it doesn't make sense not to have a car. But that is 13 homes. Sorry.
11 homes
11.
and 6.10 acres.
So, you know, we talked about
6.10 acres.
Yes, 6 acres. 6.10.
11.
6
So-
11 homes, that's less than 2 dwelling units per acre.
Yeah,
It's
that's
1.8.
really, yeah, that's
so.
That's low density.
very.
So from a market-driven perspective, based on what you said about the 30 to 40% saying that they want other types of homes, are we going to attract the developers or the builders that want to actually say, hey, this one is prime for a triplex development or a cottage court? Or are we going to continue just to see, because we allow the single family, or that's the trend? I mean, at what point will markets begin to tell us that they will come to Belmont and not, I guess, because we don't have the infrastructure for transportation, but can you just speak about that, knowing where that development is, 11 units, you could get it up to higher than that, right? With a different type of development that isn't currently allowed. So what would be the process, or what would be the driver for someone to say, hey, this is perfect for missing middle?
Well, instantaneously, as soon as you zone it, as soon as you allow your zoning to allow it, as soon as you write your zoning to allow it, there will be people who will come to want to build it. That's not an issue. The market is there, and all the builders know that. This isn't we're taking a risk, this, that, and the other. Belmont is basically Charlotte, right? It's in the 10, 11 room core of the city. You're closer to downtown Charlotte than Matthews, Pineville, Mid Hill are. So the only thing separating it is the river, and that mental barrier has gone away quite easily over the last 10, 15 years. So if you do that, they will come and they will build it here, but you're going to have to build it at higher density than that. The average U.S. town, historically, averages 8 to 12 units per acre. You drive around these beautiful towns, around the courthouse square, into these neighborhoods that Norman Rockwell painted, and so forth and so on. Those are all averaging 8 to 12 units an acre. Right?
So you're basically saying if we had allowed it 3 or 4 years ago, that would be developed as some
Yes.
sort of
Yes.
duplex, triplex, or
Yes, but you would have to make sure your code, now remember, the path of least resistance for most builders is they're gonna come in and follow your zoning, but they're not gonna bell and whistle the architecture and design if all they need to do is hit minimal aspects of the zoning, right? And you could end up with some really crappy looking thing, yeah. Your zoning has to contextually craft regulations that dictate that the development, how it functions, how it sits, what it looks like in its disposition, how the green spaces are oriented. That's a very different thing from a single family subdivision house, which basically says enough property around it to not have to matter. It doesn't matter what the rest of it's doing. It's so far back from everything, it's okay. These are all tight, so there has to be an etiquette about how these units speak to one another within a site plan. So for example, at 6 acres, you would probably want to be looking at around, how many units total? 11. You probably would, for someone to come in and say, to make their money, because developers always want to make their money, and provide a product that the city would probably want to have in their standards, you're going to need probably 3 times that number of houses on that property.
you're not doing that with a single family, you're doing it with a different form, which is.
Yeah, well, the cottage courts are all single family. They're just.
Well, right, but.
And if you didn't want to do single family on that lot and you allowed a range within a different zoning category that said we can do, go back to the first couple of slides for the farmer. Right. You know, you can cluster it, unlike regular zoning, which says this zoning is just for single family, and that zoning for single family is only single family housing, 5,000 square feet on lots, or 10,000 square feet on lots, and they all have a different color, like it's a different zoning district. Here you would cluster. You would say triplex, duplex, or cottage courts all can be within the same zoning district. And you write the codes for that district that say on this piece of property you can do either or one of those. And they could choose. So if it wasn't single family housing, they could do an apartment courtyard building and put 3 little apartment courtyard buildings facing into the green that would have 4 or 5 units each. Right? They put 20, 25 units on there and they all look like housing.
So where do you start looking in the city to put that? Because, you know, in Charlotte, they may not be able to get by without parking. Here you're going to have it to some degree. And so you take the Central South, if you go from 11 houses and you put 30 in there, that's what you hear in Belmont now is the traffic is horrendous, right? And so how do you deal with that? And where would you put that?
Yep.
Do you go down the peninsula with that, or you keep it more in the center city? And
keep it more in the center city, and for this reason. First, the idea that you're going to solve your parking problem, let me fill you in on a big secret that the transportation industry doesn't tell you, because they still want to do all their transportation TIAs and stuff. You're never going to solve your traffic problem. It is baked into everything. It will always be here. And even if you do nothing, it will get worse. Never going to be solved. A place like Belmont, especially because you're on a peninsula, not only is it not ever going to be solved, even if you were to stop growth now, you will be choking on traffic in 15 years. So don't let traffic, I know it's the hardest thing. Everybody comes into the hearings and they go, oh my God, traffic is so bad. This, that, and the other. I can't turn around my driveway. I'm at the light for 2 minutes, blah, blah, blah. It's not your problem. You can't solve it. No one can solve that problem. And if you stop growth completely, not only are you not solving the problem, but you're also going to go bankrupt as a community. So there's no out for solving the traffic problem. What you can do is you can mitigate how awful it will be by giving people options to not need to be in their car as much. So when they have to be in their car to go to Publix or Harris Teeter, it's maybe less than they would have to if they had to do it all the time. If they could walk to something, if they could not have to be isolated from these uses that can provide food in an alternative to having to go to the grocery store every week, family to do other things to get food, go to a market, go to a restaurant, and minimize the number of trips that you have to be in to solve the traffic, then you're doing something. You hear all these reports, how terrible it is, and it's true. Traffic in New York City is awful. Right? It's horrific all the time, 24/7. It's a mess. How many people are actually driving in New York all the time? It sounds horrific for people like us who have to be in our car every single day to do every single thing. And then you realize that you hear in these letters, in these reports, that it takes 2 hours to do anything in New York. You're going, oh my God, these people are in their car 24 hours a day. No. People in New York rarely drive. And when they do, they're in crappy traffic. But most of the time, they're walking around. Or they're in transit.
All right.
Or parking. There's no parking in New York. It costs $120,000 to park a car in a parking space in Manhattan a year. Right? And everybody goes, wow, I've got 2 cars. Can you imagine spending $250,000 a year to park? No. Very few of them actually need to park all the time. So
If no one's actually, if people are actually driving very rarely, then where does all the traffic come from?
all the people coming into the city to access all the amenities, all the suburbanites that are living cheaper on the outside, they want to pay all that stuff in the middle, they're the ones stuck in traffic.
Or you live out in New Jersey,
So-
you drive an hour to the train station, and you ride a train in for an hour.
People are gonna live here, not all of them are gonna work in Belmont.
True.
Okay, they're gonna work in Charlotte or somewhere else. So the idea about having houses that don't have parking is a non-starter.
Well, there's a
Agreed,
lot
I'm
of
not saying-
people working from,
No. I said reduce minimum, put maximum. You're never gonna not be able to use park, you always will have to have cars here. The thing is, you won't have to have a car for every single trip, and you won't need to have the required amount of parking that the minimum mandates, which is all made up anyway.
Well, that's assuming, when you say you don't need a car for every trip, you're assuming that you can go get a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk. And if you walk 5 minutes in any direction downtown, I mean, you can't find a gallon of milk.
Now,
Yeah, now, but I mean, we're gonna change our code and ordinance to possibly for this missing middle, you know, with limited parking or change our parking requirements. I mean, I don't think we're at the place yet where people are gonna give up their cars.
no one's telling anybody to give up their cars. What we're saying is the following. If you are able to craft your zoning ordinance, and Beth Zoning is doing the same thing right now, craft your zoning ordinance to allow missing middle type to occur in your community, you will build up the density around these cores and corridors where those uses sit within a 5 or 10 minute walk. And the market will begin to provide those uses in those corridors. South End didn't just all of a sudden happen to show up with restaurants and the grocery store and all that stuff. It was a wasteland, right? And it didn't pop up because of the light rail line, right? They changed the zoning, and they used the light rail line as an excuse. The zoning pumped more people into those spaces, and the people is what attracted the attention of the commercial builders and the users. And then they came and filled in the gaps. And now that there is retail and people, who's next? Office, employment. No one used to work in South End. There were no office buildings in South End. And now you'll notice that there are 2 tower cranes in South End, about to be 3 or 4 more, depending on the interest rates, and they're building office towers in South End. In a market that if 20 years ago, if you were to tell me that they were going to build a 25-story Class A office building at the corner of such and such and such and such in South End, you go, what are you smoking? Right? So it's step by step, but the first thing is the housing. The housing provided the density. The density attracted the commercial tenants.
To go back to Walter's comment about Central Park, I think it's a good example. If you were to increase that density to where there's 25 families on that property, on 6 acres, what I'm hearing is you now have double the amount of tax base on a piece of property on 6 acres that you don't have as it's currently is being built now. And then take it further with parking, that's now 26 families that can walk to First Premise, they can walk to First Baptist, they can walk to downtown, maybe not walk to get a loaf of bread, but you're reducing not just the grocery store trip, it's reducing other trips. And if you, what do you say, 7 to 12 trips a person?
Depending on where you are, 9 to 17.
So if you could just reduce that by a quarter, then you're reducing the load on our roads because people are using different types of transportation, whether it's walking or bikes, or maybe at some point light rail or a bus, right?
It comes in categories, right? Like everyone's saying, do not get rid of the car. The car is going to have to be here because people need to do this. If you're close in town, like you said, remember the missing middle we're talking about is happening in a circle or a corridor that's a 5-minute walk or a 10-minute walk, 1,200 feet to 2,400 feet from those cores and corridors. It's not a lot of area. In those areas is where you want to begin to deploy this type of housing because that's what sets the stage for all the other things we just talked about.
You could use education, right? So if you did this near the middle school and the high school, that reduces trips for people taking their business school or buses.
It reduces
allowing people to walk.
But, I mean, to what you're saying on that piece of property, I mean, the exact opposite could be true. I mean, we're talking theoretical education and people absorbing that and incorporating it into their lifestyle. You put 25 homes on there, let's assume they're all gainfully employed. And some of them may work from home, some may not. The problem on Central is all those cars coming out at one time near that traffic light, and that's going to be a problem. So I mean, that's the flip side of the argument. We're assuming, I mean, on Sunday they walk to church, that's great. Our problem's Monday through Friday between 7:30 and 9, and in the evenings. So I mean, theoretically, I mean, I like it, but the practical application, I'm not sure. I mean, for me, it's not proven to me.
Well, there are ways. It's 5, so I just want to jump in here on a minute. For a minute, I don't want to get hung up on parking because part of this presentation was to introduce the concept of the missing middle, to see if this is something you want to further look into. It needs to be very specific to fit Belmont. We said that initially. You just can't cut and paste out of the book or what other cities are doing, because we may have more of an emphasis on the need for parking, for example, that was just spoken about. However, we want to make sure that this missing middle is in our core, that fulfills the gaps. I can tell you, since I've been with the city for 8 years, and I've had many developers come in and ask about triplexes. We only allow townhomes if it's in a new development. So a lot of infill situation where you want the density where people can walk. They have asked us to be able to do that. Our ordinance doesn't allow for it. And then furthermore, we have our comprehensive land use plan that in theory, we plan for density, but then they go through a process of conditional zoning and so forth. So there's this feel that there's not a lot of support from the city for this housing, which I think it is definitely the type of housing that's missing. So we're bridging that gap between single family and the large apartment complexes that we prefer to see out on the boulevard. So this just opens the door for, if we're interested, to write an ordinance that allows for different housing types in the right setting in Belmont with the right performance criteria for Belmont as well, such as parking, height, and other important factors to fit within our community that can help address our issues related to affordable housing that we've talked about, provide housing choice. All of this is consistent with the comprehensive land use plan. So we envision a choice in housing. This is a pathway to get a building form that fits our community, that will provide and meet the needs for the future. And we have the opportunity of writing this as a group with a steering committee, with public engagement to ensure that we're writing it to fit Belmont, and we can keep the large apartment complexes out on the boulevard where we're planning to have the light rail and so forth. So I think this is a real opportunity for us. We're not going to look at doing the missing middle out on the peninsula. That's not where it's needed. The whole concept is to fall back on historic building forms that are already here and blended in our community that we have forgotten about. So in this presentation, I was hoping to provide information to the Planning Board and Council, get support for moving forward with a consultant and a steering committee in the process to help write this, amend our land development code to introduce this and blend it into the city where it's needed. So I was hoping to get support from the Planning Board and Council to move forward. If you'd like to pursue this.
I definitely would. You're talking about an example. If I have a creative dreamer husband, and when he wanted to do Stone Manor Village, all those row houses along Keener were what he wanted to set up with live work units. Think about how different the feel would be on Keener with the townhouses and this if that had happened. But Belmont was not quite there yet. So I think that it's something we definitely need to pursue. All of the people who are coming to us and say, well, I want to subdivide this lot in this in the park there near behind the cemetery and that kind of thing. We had several of those. This would have been a wonderful opportunity to have that type of housing available as opposed to just splitting doing two single families. So I think it's going to be tricky to to manage with all the stuff we're dealing with here, but I think it's definitely worthwhile.
You know, another thing, the bridge across the river, if you had that done, we wouldn't be having a lot of the traffic problems that we have right now in South Florida Road.
Would it be, well,
Yes.
even if
I mean,
the bridge is across there, you're still gonna have traffic.
and we've got to play with the hand we're dealt.
Yeah.
But the parking issue is not a big deal for Belmont. You can do these missing middle housing, and you can still park everybody on the property and not have the impact that we're talking about, because you don't have a lot of land to do it on. That's it. Don't let the parking be the determinant of whether you take this or not. You can park it just like you park everything else. And over time, it will diminish the need for that parking. That's to happen as it happens, not big ticket.
Yeah, I like the concept. I think it's worth pursuing. I think the big challenge is, so where do you start? What's the next step? Would you start looking at the areas in the city that you would like to see the middle? Identify that
It's easy.
first.
I mean, yeah, it's done so much now that it's almost, it's an easy process.
You fix the radius.
You check out, you find origin destination traffic, you find out where your corridors or your commercial is, you see where people are going, and then you fix the radius.
The city of Belmont is all the way down the South North Road, which is the
It does, but there's no commercial corridors in that whole thing. So you're looking at a 5-minute walk around downtown, 10-minute walk around downtown, for example, let's say, and then look at some corridors like Park Street. That's about it. I'm not going to get anything out of it.
So just point of clarification on the whole part.
Maybe around the Harris Teeter. That's a time of the.
As far down as you.
Yeah.
That's about maybe that's a stretch.
So on the parking side of things, I didn't really hear, right, eliminate parking at the missing middle, at the homes necessarily, right? That you could park everybody in these places. I also heard though about parking in other places, like the Walmarts and your office buildings and things where maximums might be more appropriate. Is that
For certain. I mean, you look at your
I
parking.
mean, I think that just needs to be clarified, that it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
about the residential parking, it's
Correct.
about the commercial parking that, where people are going from point A to point B, and so you're having to build parking for me driving 7 different places in one day for one spot. And what if I don't take all 7 of those trips a day? Maybe one week I only take 5. Well, you've now paid for 2 parking spaces for me that I'm not using.
That's a good point. It's mostly for the commercial that is overly parked. Most residential, except for multifamily, is adequately parked, unless you're talking about 1 per bedroom. That's crazy. But yeah, for everything else.
Matt, you know what's coming to the old Bibles? Goodwill.
What's the format here, Mr. Mayor? We get both the planning board and the city
So-
council here.
So might
She's
it, well, so might it just work about, to see, first of all, if you have any
Great
comments or
entrance and
questions, we'd love to hear it. But we'd like to keep moving on the agenda, maybe just a raise of hands by the planning board and council members,
Well,
of those that are interested in pursuing
I mean,
this,
my
or-
question, I mean, it's nice to pursue. I mean, it would be theoretically interesting to pursue, but consultants cost money. And, my fear would be if we spend the money on the consultant and we get a bunch of proposals and then it comes to us and we all decide, well, we're staring at the abyss and we don't really want to take that step, then we've just spent a lot of money on something that we decided, no, we're not comfortable with this. So, I mean, that's sort of my quandary, is if we indicate we're interested, if we take the step, like, is it going to lead to something, or are we going to then step back after we've spent all this money on a consultant and all the time to get it prepared and ready?
Basically, to build off that, what are we expecting the consultant to tell us that we don't already know?
A lot when it comes to the missing middle. It is, I started on the draft, and again, the missing middle book is about that thick, and there's a lot of performance standards. You just can't cut and paste. You have to ensure that it's right for a community, that we identify the boundaries where we want this, so it's the housing types are placed in the right area, it makes sense, our performance standards, and we want buy-in from the community. So it is a process. And it's important to ensure that we get something that will be usable and has been written and customized to fit our community. So we could start with, if there's interest, I could at least put something out to get some cost estimates of what we're looking at. If there's interest, if there's no interest, you know,
I hear
we
the
will.
word what we want. Is there a need?
Yeah, what problem are we actually trying to solve here?
Is there a need?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, are we gonna go broke if we don't do this? Is the city gonna go broke if we don't have this kind of housing?
No,
We're not gonna go broke, but are we,
People can't live here.
yeah.
Well,
I mean, our teachers can't live here, our police officers can't live here, our fire department people can't live here because they can't afford to live here. It's $500,000 for a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house.
Well, just again, this stemmed from the whole discussion. We've had prior discussions about affordability and different housing types. So housing is, I'll use the term attainable.
Yes.
Because affordable means a lot of different things to different people. But housing choice, and again, our ordinance right now, what was interesting, if you look at our land development code under the housing types, there are pictures of triplexes and quadruplexes in the detached housing type, but the language has been removed at some point in time that would actually allow that in the community. So I have examples, some pretty pictures, but there's no way to get there. So this is not something brand new. There are these housing types in our community. They provide density, housing option, affordability, and we do have that large gap. We have single family, if you can afford a single family, great, or these large apartment complexes that are being proposed to come in. This provides opportunity in the middle. So those newly graduated college students or new professionals coming into our community have a housing option that's affordable in an area that makes sense, that it's walkable, they can enjoy Belmont.
Well, let me ask you, if it was in the code, would it not be as simple as just reintroducing it since the pictures are already there? We just say this is now going to be allowed. And I guess my second question is, if developers were coming and asking about this, why didn't it come up to us sooner? Because the elimination of the apartment complex seems to be what has triggered this.
No, there is, and I'm going to go back to the discussion with council just last spring, where the small developers and builders came before the council in a workshop and discussed the ability to, the costs associated with building and providing homes and infill lots. And they talked about duets, which is like a duplex, but they're sold individually. You can only do a townhome, a for sale townhome. If it's in a brand new development, you can't do one individually. We have stacked duplexes with multifamily behind it in the city that's been operating that I haven't gotten any complaints about, or I'm unaware of any problems. Nobody's called me and say, look at all the cars that are coming out of there, and there are 8 units on this one little property. So it can fit, but it's not as simple as just, oh, I'm going to just write staff, or excuse me, have staff write the ordinance. You need some assistance to ensure that when we do it right, and we're not regretting. We're not taking something from 20, 25 years ago and it's not relevant today. We want to make sure we get it right, work with the community. So it's an education process as well, because we just put something back in, it starts being built next to somebody, they're going to be upset going, what is this fourplex next to me? It's a whole process for input from the community as well.
But
I'll say one more with the talked about examples, and I'll use the Stowe Manor Village. If you look at that, how that went together and fit in with the whole neighborhood, that's what you're looking at. In the 90s, we were headed that direction, and we had a lot of people playing with our development code and that kind of thing, and so we went back that other direction, which is probably not the best for what we're looking at now. So I think that's the reason I want to look at it, because I would like to see us incorporate as much as we can. We may not be able to do all of what Demetri's talking about, but some of it we may be able to figure out.
And to Shelley's point too, I do agree with you, because we can tailor it to what fits Belmont's needs as opposed to us just putting some text out there and then it's a free-for-all. But I'm also curious because we brought this up at our goal setting session, that we were talking about it's almost close to time to review the comprehensive land use plan. Is this something, okay, maybe half and half saying let's do it, let's not do it, maybe we don't want to spend the money, but could we not target this specifically to get the public's input? Because I believe the comment was made, and I do agree that affordability is an issue here in Belmont. You have one extreme to the other, and unfortunately that lower income is starting to diminish here. So I would be interested to see what the citizens have to say during a rewrite or a review, I should say, not a rewrite, a review of the comprehensive land use plan.
Yes, we can incorporate that within the comprehensive land use plan. And again, the language in our existing comprehensive land use plan envisions a choice of housing. So a lot of it's already there. What we don't have are the regulations that implement that vision. So we could incorporate it together, but again, the vision's already there. What we're missing is the regulations to implement that, especially within our downtown core area. It talks about choice of housing, different housing choices, and we just want to fine tune it to avoid the large apartment building developments, keep that out where it should be, and introduce these different forms that will fit our comprehensive land use plan better.
The dilemma is that today a lot of the builders are jumping on the bandwagon for this higher density stuff, are building it in the suburbs, and they think it's just, oh, I can do that, I can do it here too. Let's look at their suburban duplex or triplex project or a little apartment mansion thing, which they put on a big lot, and then they just cut and paste it into an urban setting, and it's a disaster. And most communities that just do a cut and paste code end up with that cut and paste product, and the backlash is intense.
Yeah.
It's really awful.
See, and I guess for me, from my perspective, that's not what I think would benefit our city.
So I think the affordability is a big thing, and it's in the comprehensive land use plan now, right? And so it's not just people starting out. You got elderly people that have been here, and probably taxes and all that are starting to push them out if they had a smaller place they could go to. So it's not just young people, it's the older folks too. But I think that's huge.
Yeah, I think being intentional about the where for this is important. Also, I think even to Alex's point about the comprehensive land use plan, even some education among the public is important too, because I think when we say diversity of housing choices, most people kind of say, oh, well, that means either houses or apartments. And I don't know that most people are necessarily thinking about these other building forms. But then, as far as like, I think having a goal for this would also be a good idea. And I think affordability or attainability, whatever we're calling it, this makes sense for that. I'm not quite sold on the parking part of it yet, but I guess anecdotally I have noticed just kind of driving around that people don't typically use the streets perhaps as much as they could, and that could be another thing that's sort of a public education opportunity. But I guess I'm not necessarily opposed to kind of seeing some ideas on this, but I think that one thing that has sort of held, I don't want to say held back, but maybe impact the efficiency or the effectiveness of this is that we don't have a lot of that kind of, I don't know, we talk a lot about like grocery stores and that sort of thing. Like there's basically the Harris Teeter down on South Point, and then you come up here at the Walmart, and then the Aldi if you're looking for a good deal. But outside, like there's not a whole lot of that sort of development, and there doesn't appear to be a ton of interest, I guess, particularly in the downtown core for that. A lot of the projects I know we've seen lately seem to be very heavy on the residential, and the commercial is kind of an afterthought. My preference has always been to kind of, figure out a way to sort of encourage more commercial development, because I think once you have that, if you give people a reason to get out and walk down the street to the store or whatever, they'll do it. I don't know necessarily how we fix that But
It's the chicken and the egg.
Yeah, exactly. You need the rooftops and the density to attract businesses. So businesses don't go where they can't be successful. They look at the income in the area for a certain distance, the number of housing units, families, and everything. It's all a formula. So there's a reason Belmont Town Center got their approval years ago, 10 years ago or so, and they're still not built out. They waited because they were waiting for the population, the rooftops, to come into the area before they started building. So, yeah.
Some cities will provide subsidization grants to kickstart a sort of show piece that could be retail, and then have that as the thing that is the activator for the whole residential. But you've got to have the rooftops first. Anywhere you go, wherever you see that happen, it's the rooftops come first, and then the market follows. Just like in South and any other place.
Well, Shirley, the only thing that I would say, I'm not opposed to this. I think we need the choice, affordability. I think for me, I think the issue is going to be in your performance standards. Because I think when you start talking duplexes and triplexes, I mean, I have something like this in my mind. You know, you have these two block buildings that are joined on a corner or whatever. I think that's where people push back. I don't want that next to me. But the Woodrow Wonder, you know, if you can incorporate those kind of standards to where it looks like a home, you're not going to get the resistance, I think, that you may to these other type buildings. So I think for me, that's going to be the key component is it's going to have to fit seamlessly.
Yeah, and that's what missing middle is all about. If it doesn't fit in seamlessly, it's not missing middle.
Right. So on the understanding that, you know, this is going to be tailored to Belmont and specific to Belmont, it sounds like there's interest in pursuing this, and obviously that can take a lot of permutations.
I was going to say, so can staff go and work on a implementation or approach, whether it's part of the comprehensive land use plan update, the LDC, to see what the plan is to moving forward and bring that back to everyone? Yes.
It sounds like working with Gastonia, and they haven't fully incorporated all of these housing types of the missing middle into their code. They focused on cottage courts. Is there a phased approach that would be cognizant of the money, the dollars that we spend, so that we focus more on the more attainable housing rather than just all of them at once and see if one or two of them stick?
Yeah, man, and that's nailed it. Reason we're going the way we're doing it in Gastonia, they too did not patch out the big bucks into the whole thing at once. So we have staged it over a 5-year period, right? We started with cottage courts and side yard homes. We redid the townhomes. We're now doing the small apartment and the middle apartment size buildings. And we're going to wrap it up with the shop house that works next year. So we'll have the entire missing middle segment, but we're doing it 1 year at a time in digestible bits. It is an educational process, as Shelley was saying. You got to get, you know, the citizenry back involved. You got to get the public works department to understand how this works. You got to get the finance people. So yeah, it's a lot of stuff, but you can do it in little chunks. And I would recommend doing it that way because I've worked on the big project, and none of them, very rarely do they come out well. It's always been the very incremental ones that do better.
Thank you, Demetri. Appreciate it. So we'll discuss this, figure out what direction we're going to go. Okay, so, next item on the agenda is major development plan discussion regarding a replacement process for major development plan level projects. Discussion will include process type, legislative, quasi-judicial, or administrative and threshold.
Thank you, Mayor. So we have been talking about the city's major development plan process for a couple of years now at various council workshops where we've received directive from the council to work with the planning and zoning board on the appropriate alternative process to ultimately remove our major development plan process. So just real briefly, as a reminder, the state legislature provides 3 basic ways to process land use decisions. There's administrative, which are over the counter, legislative, which are conditional zonings, rezonings, and of course text amendments. Then there's a quasi-judicial where in Belmont, a special use permit goes before the city council. The variances and appeals go to the Board of Adjustment. So we have this other sort of interesting process that doesn't fall into any of those categories, the major development plan process that consists of 3 different thresholds. If you're doing a major residential subdivision, 8 lots or more, or a non-residential subdivision consisting of 4 lots or more, such as a shopping center without parcels, or buildings that are larger than 30,000 square feet in gross area. So although we call that a by right, they're complying with every regulation in our land development code. We still make them go through a process, the public process of having a community meeting, going to the planning board for a recommendation to the city council. The discussions previously focused on how this this process really isn't working for us. It gives the public the feel that it can be denied. And again, basically, if you follow state law, if it complies with all the regulations, you're supposed to approve it. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a possible legal action. But again, the process itself, although well-intended to provide opportunity for the neighboring property owners to provide input, to see what's coming, some input from the planning board as well as city council to maybe fine-tune a development, it is very confusing to not only decision makers but the general public. So we went to the planning board about I'm going to skip these and jump to here. We took the issue to the Planning and Zoning Board for discussion, and again, outlining the 3 different processes that are available for land use decisions. Again, we have thresholds that trigger a major development plan. Based on council's input, they preferred the conditional zoning process. I'm going to turn this over to the chairman and let him speak to this a bit about the planning board's discussion, but we went through all 3 different processes, and the planning board did not have the same sentiment about which process to fall into.
Sure. I did not know that I was supposed to.
Okay.
So I will look to my board, who's also here with me, to help out in getting through this. Well, first, I think we do appreciate you coming to us and asking for some clarification and having us look at these 3 different options in a little bit more detail. It was, I don't want to say it was a huge discussion, but I think among all of us, we had our own ideas about what the process should be. I would offer that it was a little bit in a vacuum, that we didn't understand why you were asking us to look at these 3 options. But now that we are here where we are today, on the administrative side, well, let me step back. The by rights developments, we've had a number of them over the past, I would say, year. You'll probably go back to our minutes and see that we have approved them generally unanimously. The discussion that arose around by right development was we're a little unsure on our ability to approve or deny. There were comments on the fact that we appreciated being able to understand what our project was coming to do and having that community meeting. But ultimately, we as a board were a little unsure on whether or not we should deny coming to this request. So it puts us in a little bit of a bad position. I see some nods, maybe. So I guess I would like to hear from you all to understand why this major development plan process needs to continue. If it's because the council would like
and still incorporate the community meetings and still have oversight or be aware of projects, then obviously we can respond to that. I would venture to say that most of the board would just as soon make that an administrative process rather than conditional zoning because they are complying with the letter of the law and within our ordinance.
Mhm.
So that's one thing. And then it came up about the thresholds.
Right, which I
more
have.
than 8 lots.
Mhm.
Thank you. More than 4 lots on the non-residential, 8 lots on major residential, and then 30,000 square feet on the commercial. We weren't sure where that came from either. Central Park, we've already mentioned as part of the previous discussion. That is coming to us Thursday as a major development plan. By right, I think there might be some concerns or issues, Richard, about the traffic between that ingress point, and the light at Keener. But ultimately, that is a plot of land that someone owns that would like to develop it, and they're doing it within the letter of our law. So we too are just we didn't know if we wanted to increase that or decrease it. Some ideas about the TIA came up. If a project triggered a TIA, maybe that is the threshold by which the planning board would review a case, and then ultimately, whether or not we have a voice in it or not, approval or denial. Certainly just a recommendation to you all, but allowing us to at least see that case if a TIA was part of that threshold. But we didn't really get anywhere. We had some great discussions, but we never really got to a point where we understood the ask to be able to make a written recommendation back to you all to understand where it came from and ultimately what is best for the city.
Well, the ask sort of is along the lines that Shelley set forth in her introduction. I mean, we struggle with this process because I think it creates a false sense in some of the public that, well, if you're getting input from me at a community meeting or at a planning board meeting or council meeting, well, then I would have some anticipation that input would matter, would make a difference, would be listened to. And I know if we're asked to vote on something, why, if there's no choice, it's a false choice. As Richard has said, if you're given a choice to vote on something, then you tend to think that would be an actual choice, not that you'd be required to go one way. And I just think it, and I've sort of been making a fuss about this. I was probably the one that put that on the March 2020 thing because I just don't understand it. Why we're voting on something that's by right. And it just creates confusion. It creates public discontent because they think, well, I've got all these concerns, and then you just went ahead, you didn't listen, you voted on it anyway. Why are we voting on something if the vote has to be one way? And so that to me is something I think needs to be cleaned up. And I'm not sure exactly which way it needs to go. I just know that this way, I just think leads to confusion and public misunderstanding and dissatisfaction. I liked Walter's, I think it was Walter that made the idea, because I was at the meeting where you discussed it, about, because usually, and the case in point was the one we did, the industrial warehouse at the Oaks, usually the issue involves traffic. The other, that's the issue that, well, yes, it's by right, but there's still some traffic concerns. So if it would be something that would trigger the TIA, that goes conditional. If it wouldn't, then it's just administrative. I think that's a good threshold.
Are you suggesting that something could trigger something that would violate the by right? The TIA would? That it would violate by right? It would allow for planning and a community to happen. Does it mean that
no.
At the Henry Chapel Road briefing that many of us went to, the young lady who gave the presentation, whose name escapes me right now,
Bridget
said, Bridget said, we're voluntarily giving you this presentation. And I thought that was pretty nice because it was a by right.
Yeah, that is
project.
true.
So
Now,
I think the way you do that, if it is by right, and you have, you ask the developer, would they give the thing? Would they give the presentation? And if so, we're here to listen to what you have to say, but it has to be made clear that the law says we can do this as it is right now, but we're here to listen to what you may have to say, and we may include some of your recommendations. That way it takes everybody off the hook.
Whether people choose to listen to that or not and understand that.
Yeah, but at least
Yes.
you're telling the community what the rules are, so they can understand that this developer doesn't have to listen to this. They don't even have to have a daggone presentation.
Now they do not. Now I just want to clarify one thing.
That was old.
That
right?
was under. They were I'm not grandfathered in, where the current major development plan process was changed subsequent to their submission of their plan. So there was some confusion about that. They were right that they did not have to do that. But if somebody wanted to come today and have a major development plan, they would have to have one community meeting.
That is correct.
But the comments still stand.
Yes.
If it's by right, we are having this thing because we have to have it by law. We don't have to listen to, we may accept some of your recommendations or not, but the city council doesn't have a vote on this because it's by law. And that tamps everything down at the get-go.
Which is why, as part of our discussion, we recommended it might just go administrative. Yeah. Why does it need to come to planning and zoning to hear what they have or have not done in a community meeting when ultimately our vote for council doesn't matter, and then ultimately your vote really doesn't matter either, and it can be done by right.
And there have been a lot of misconceptions because sometimes our vote has not been unanimous, so it ends up that some of us don't look like the good guys, we look like the bad guys. And I'm sure it's happened with you guys too, probably.
The oath wasn't unanimous.
That's correct.
And to each his own.
Yeah.
But so my question would be though, do we is it still by right if we want to make it conditional on triggering the TIA?
Is the TIA though not already a trigger point? Because the TIA isn't necessarily something you have to accept. That's part of negotiation.
Yeah.
No, we have thresholds in our ordinance that say whether or not we require.
But once, in our case, Kimley Horn, once they present a recommendation, that's still a negotiation. There's more than one solution to the TIA.
That's correct, and ultimately what's presented to council, though, is a firm.
So if you were the developer, though, you trigger the TIA, you go through negotiation, council accepts the TIA, does that open them up, though, to now having to go through all these other potential conditions? Does that mean
I hear what you're saying, so if they comply with all the other regulations. Okay.
That triggers
So,
that sounds like it's an extra step.
So you're correct. This would be a new threshold. So right now we have, let me get to the slide. We have, these are our current thresholds. And in most cases, I don't know where I went, but we have 3 thresholds. 3 thresholds, not this one, that's the proposed. These are thresholds for the major development process. So in most cases, a TIA would not be required except for number 3. For example, a very large, a Walmart, something that large, or very large residential subdivision.
Central Park didn't need one, but
I would imagine.
Nixon Road did not, however, Henry's Chapel did.
Yes.
Yeah, 100 or 50 on the peninsula.
Nixon? No, Nixon's 36.
Nixon was 36.
No, yes, that was 36.
Yeah.
It did not require one. That's correct.
You're thinking of the townhome development.
Smith Farm.
Yeah.
Smith Farm. Yeah, that did not meet a threshold either, but they went through a conditional zoning.
Well, ultimately 75,
It was
I
70.
believe.
Yeah.
But it was originally proposed.
So I'd like
in 99.
to point this out. So to help address your question, there's a process, a quasi-judicial process called a special use permit. That is when there's a proposed project that can typically have impacts to neighboring properties. It could be a gas station next to a residential district, or it could be a development that requires a traffic analysis, you know, that's something larger or a very large subdivision. The town of Huntersville uses the special use permit as their approving process for their larger subdivisions, or when they require a traffic analysis. Now, what was mentioned is the legislative conditional zoning. Many of our large developments come through as conditional zonings, and that is because in most cases they need relief. The intent behind this is we're changing someone's zoning or fine-tuning a zoning district where they're proposing something a little bit unusual, and that's where the negotiations come in. So conditional zoning process works. My concern is if you have compliance with every other regulation, they're not changing the zoning, they're not asking for relief, they do have to do a traffic study, say. You know, my question is, why can't they go through a special use permit? You're basing it off of required findings of fact. It's supposed to be very fact-based. You can condition to address the impacts. So you can condition that they do all the traffic improvements, or they add this extra buffer or something like that. It's a lot of people don't like it because it's quasi-judicial. You're in a tighter box.
And we have to listen to John Russell on end.
Well,
but
you're in a tighter box, but it seems to fit. I think it would fit the situation better
you know,
than
and
a
that
conditional
from their
zoning.
perspective, it wouldn't. You know,
They wouldn't
it wouldn't.
hear it.
It would come straight to
It would
us.
go
So it would
straight
either
to
be
council.
administrative
That's
or
correct.
special use permit and come straight to us. You all would be alleviated from it.
What are you permitting in that case? What are you going to permit?
Well, the thresholds would need to be established. So it could be if something requires a traffic analysis. So say it's a subdivision or a large building that requires a traffic analysis, we'd say, okay, you met this threshold, you got to go special use permit, you go directly to council. You still have.
So the TIA comes and says you need to expand on these intersections. Now you need a permit to do that. Is that what we're saying?
We're saying it's a threshold for a process, yes.
Okay, so then could the council then say, we're not going to approve your permit until you do X, Y, and Z?
Yes.
Oh, that's a conditional situation, different from conditional zoning.
But they're not changing their zoning.
That's a conditional TIA then, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is that a new rule?
No, it's not. So again, we're mixing conditional zoning, and a TIA is required whether it's administrative, special use permit, could be required in every case. What we're saying is to remove the major development plan process, because my understanding from council, you still want to have some controls based on certain thresholds. What I heard from the planning board, and I took away from I think it was the August 18th meeting, I re-listened to the audio, was if it checks all the boxes for compliance with the regulations, they don't want to see it. They would prefer that it would go directly to council because they understand council.
And let me just add to that.
Okay.
Part of our response to that was that we have been appointed by you all to be a very technical oriented board. And so we bring a level of expertise on the technical side of things that doesn't cross the political lines that you guys obviously have to deal with. So we felt like us looking at from a technical standpoint, a by right development, we're not providing anything of value. What changes is when it goes to land use and the politics of it, that we don't have a say in it. We don't have that technical savviness, and we weren't elected to do that. So
now, also to that point, though, if it's an issue where it follows the rules, maybe it should be following the rules because the rules are bad. We would rather see, well, at least I would rather see it as a text amendment to change the rules, not everything a conditional political process.
And then we are involved. Right. We would love to be part of text amendments that make our code better.
Yeah,
that's we can weigh in on that. We are the technical board that can help you do that.
I mean, I understand your perspective on that. I mean, you just basically become a pass-through at that point.
We have felt that way.
Yeah.
I mean,
So we've had discussions in the past about making everything conditional. I mean, and we batted that around, the pros and cons. I mean, so what would be the pros and cons of that
Well,
approach?
the cons is, again,
We'd be dealing with all sorts of things that really, that don't even come to the planning board.
right.
That
So
you
it's
just do
all,
administratively.
yeah, it's all about thresholds, thresholds establish, the whole focus of this is to get rid of this odd process that we have that isn't administrative, it's not legislative or quasi-judicial. So either we're going to review everything administratively and let it be reviewed at staff level, and we heard, no, we want some more layers on that. Well, then that leaves us special use permit, which I can tell you staff, from my perspective, would prefer over conditional zoning. Again, if they're not asking for any relief, but they hit these thresholds because there's potential impact and the council wants to see it, to me, that's the appropriate vehicle. So to go before you, so it still gets noticed, they still public comment, you can condition it, a special use permit gets recorded on the property as well.
We don't usually do community meetings with SUPs, though.
No,
right?
they don't. You're right. On community meetings, that's correct. Special use permit because they're quasi.
Yeah, and you can't.
That's a little tough.
Yeah, and public
area.
comment is sort of restricted because you can't just show up and say, well, hey, I've got these concerns. Like, you actually have to have evidence. And
that's right. But
yeah.
then that puts a little more weight in somebody actually showing up with actual facts.
Well, yes, actual facts can be important.
Hearsay,
yes.
Through conditional zoning sometimes.
I've got a thought. Parks, you're the city attorney. What do you think about this?
Planning and legal clash on this subject because most of I understand Shelley's thinking, but most of the legal community has tried to get rid of special use permits because of the things you were just describing. The public doesn't understand that they can't stand up and give their opinion. They don't come and say, we have to. We're only allowed to testify about facts, and you tell them to sit down, you can't testify. It just doesn't. It's a awkward.
So we'd be trading one situation, creating public confusion, discontent with another, basically.
Well, and did we not, after the last SUP, kind of at least directionally also trying to strike down the SUP?
Or restrict the situations.
Or restrict the situation as well, yeah.
It's just, there's so many aspects to the special use permit, the bias, you can't talk to anybody ahead of time, you can't have the
it's not an easy process. I agree.
It's all, it's really a quasi-court proceeding. So,
right.
You're the judge and jury, testimony. It doesn't. It's not a comfortable process. I don't think. Probably it's awkward, and I don't know. Most jurisdictions that you talked about, Huntersville, maybe they are, but when we go to the city attorney conference, they're all talking condition.
What's counter to everything we're saying we want too? Let's talk to the stakeholders. Let's have the public input. We need them to talk about the missing middle. We need them to come our land use plan. We don't need you here.
But those are legislative acts, so they're just
but
different.
From the public's perspective.
So then it would be more about the threshold by which we see something versus a 4-lot non-residential subdivision or project. Is that something that we need to see? It doesn't have all of that impact that a TIA might have with traffic.
Well, if it's conditional zoning, it has to go to the planning board, no matter what it is.
But if you doubled all of those
thresholds, you won't hear as many.
We wouldn't hear as many.
Yes.
But is that okay with council? That would then go administrative if the special use permit is not.
If we go conditional.
Are you talking about increasing the thresholds for the TIA?
No.
Okay.
Oh.
No, it would actually be, so these are the current thresholds, and what was suggested was, it was suggested planning board that one of the thresholds, a new one, be added, that anything that requires a TIA So that would be on the peninsula subdivision, maybe 50 units or more. Typically, it's about 100 in most of the city. Then buildings of certain sizes. So it all be based on, does it meet the threshold for a TIA? That would be one threshold. Then our current other two are major subdivisions. So we require it go through major development plan for 8 residential lots, which is pretty low.
That's a lot of what we've seen.
And what about like large buildings with the square footage they're talking about?
Well, right now it's at 30,000 square feet.
Right.
In size. I do. So,
Oh, look at that.
That would be great.
So Peyton and Tiffany, I think, actually put these together for me. So these are examples of buildings and their square footages. So the Drift Restaurant was only 11,000. The small shopping center, that's where the ABC store is. That's just under 30,000 square feet. But then if our own recreational center, we did a conditional zoning on that because it needed relief, but that's 42,000 square foot.
Southport go through any process?
No, that was administrative. Did not need a traffic analysis.
What were those?
Sure.
The dorms that Belmont had.
Now they did not meet the threshold, but they met the 30,000 square feet.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was.
So they had to.
I mean, that's why I was saying, like, how big were they? I can't remember.
Yeah, they were. I want to say they were about 39,000 each, and there was 2 of them. Because they were.
So are you saying that everything else was by right except for the traffic analysis?
For the dorms or what?
For these.
Okay, so.
I'm just trying to figure out
Belmont Rec was conditional.
how you get to a conditional rezoning based on a traffic TIA. I haven't figured that out. I don't understand.
The TIA is not part of anything.
It's not. It's a possible introduction of a new threshold. Besides,
I mean, we can make anything conditional zoning if we want. We made apartments conditional anywhere. Multifamily anywhere in the city. We just said, if you want to build an apartment outside or a multifamily outside of these jurisdictions, it's conditional.
These districts, yeah.
So, I mean, couldn't we say if,
Even though it's zoned by right?
It was previously zoned by right, and we
correct.
changed it to a conditional.
Okay,
Okay.
I have no problem with changing the rules.
Yeah. I mean, and I'm assuming that's what we'd have to do as a text amendment because of the way the major development plan is. Yeah.
Yes, so we're talking about thresholds and building sizes. So again, so this Caramont Health Medical Park, that building's 54,000 square feet.
Now
Lofton Apartments, they did both I want to say they did a CUP.
They had a height issue, didn't they? Wasn't that one of the?
Yeah, they went as
The
special
stories.
use permit and a conditional because they went 4 stories.
Yes.
Now, with this, is it in aggregate, like so, or is it by building? So if I have one piece of property and I'm putting 3 buildings on there, can I put 3 30,000 or 29,000 square foot buildings on there?
That's how it's been interpreted in the past. We did want to change that.
So I do think that needs
raise
to be changed.
You know, that's an aggregate of all buildings on one property. But most of our projects do go conditional zoning because most of them are asking for relief in height or lot size. There's that's primarily what we see. But it's tough when we have, and I'm going to use Nixon Road and Central Park South, 11 lot subdivision is going through this public process that checks all the boxes. It's, they had a community meeting, which was great, and they did some extra work based on the community meeting. So it did add value. But I just want us to think about our threshold.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'm getting the sense that this is not something that's going to be resolved in those 5 minutes. So where should we head from here? I guess that's what we should.
Can we settle at least on a process? I mean, does this board want to go just conditional zoning? Then the question is going to be thresholds, because that's something that really needs to be addressed.
I mean, I kind of feel like if we've got the issues with the special use permits, then that has to be where we want to go. If we do want to keep control over some of this that involves more traffic concerns and let the others just be handled administratively, then I think the issue is going to be the thresholds.
Yeah, and I'd be comfortable with something that makes, like, it has a trigger for, like, the traffic counts, the TIA, however you want to structure it, that then forces it conditional over that threshold.
What triggers are?
We just changed them.
Triggers are TIA. What is it?
Tiffany?
There,
It's 100 trips during your peak hour, 1,000 daily trips, and on the peninsula in that designated area, it's 500 daily trips or 50 peak hour trips.
and that's south of Nixon Road is where that begins.
Just lowered it.
Yeah.
So what size subdivision? That helps me instead of the trip.
That's about a 50 unit, on the peninsula, that would be about a 50 unit subdivision, or your 100 unit subdivision, residential subdivision elsewhere in the city. And then, of course, for non-residential, it depends on the size of the building and the use.
I think this provides us a little bit better clarity on the discussion we can take back, maybe not for Thursday's agenda, but next month it provides, I think we can work with this on the direction side.
Just really quick amongst us in terms of providing direction, do we have any direction on the, we've talked about sort of subdivisions, do we have any direction on the building size that we can give to the planning board? Or like what are our initial thoughts on that?
I mean, it all seems like it comes back to traffic. At
Yeah.
least that's all anybody ever complains about to me.
Yeah.
So,
But then again, remember, I'm going to use the office warehouse. So the office warehouse that just went through did not meet the threshold, but we
that's
did
true.
require them to do a TTM, a memorandum anyway. So think about that as the office warehouse are typically lower trip generating than, say, an office building or a call center or something like that. So, you know, it may not be 30,000 square feet, maybe 100,000 square foot, or, you know, but.
I think that's key because it could be 100 and not
Yeah.
have a TIA, right? But it has those trucks that people have concerns with coming through their neighborhoods and that type of stuff.
So, do you want us just to work with the planning board, or is it council to make some suggestions as far as the building size?
I mean, I was just using the time we had to see sort of what the general sense was.
I think since you're our technical people, I think
Yeah.
if there's enough, if we've given you enough guidelines to go by, and then give us back what your thoughts are.
So December?
Okay.
Okay. So we'll work with the board.
Just don't change it after we send it up there.
All right.
Well, yeah. Yes.
I'd
skip those two items.
Yep. Yes. I agree.
So with that, thank the planning board for this workshop.
Yeah.
thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Gary Webb. Okay. Well, I mean, we can go into closed session and we can do whatever. I would